All right, so let's go ahead and get started here. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Damion Shelton. He graduated from robotics back in 2007 and followed a rather long and winding and tortuous path to his current position as Chief Technology Officer at 3 Rivers 3D, where he works on very novel 3D scanners for a variety of purposes that I'll let him tell you about.
Okay, thanks for the introduction. It's fun to be back in this room on this side rather than struggling to stay awake on that side. To that end, I had a very, very big lunch courtesy of the RI, and given that I have a day job now, was up until 3:30 working on this. So if I seem a little out of it at any point, I apologize in advance, but I'll try to make sure that I'm lively and dancing around for you. So the title of the talk is Bootstrapping a Startup 3D Scanning for Fun and Profit. The question mark there is not unintentional, as will hopefully become clear during the talk. A little bit about my background. It always surprises people when I explain sort of the genesis of the company, that I had never seen or heard of a 3D scanner prior to actually graduating, which you would think would be counterintuitive given the Robotics Institute's long track record with 3D scanning technologies. In fact, my PhD thesis work was focused on the sonic flashlight device from George Stetton's lab. I actually didn't work so much on the actual sonic flashlight device, and instead focused on a project called virtual tomographic reflection, which was a simulator of the sonic flashlight. So the reason we did this was so that in conjunction with Bobby Klatsky from psychology, we could perform some psychophysics experiments with the sonic flashlight. So this tracking cluster device on the back was tracked by an infrared tracking system. There was an organic LED display that was reflected off of this partially reflective mirror, and then a dummy ultrasound probe. And using this, we were able to run a variety of psychophysical studies and look at some of the background as to why the sonic flashlight worked. So in terms of the functionality, this on the left was the actual sonic flashlight device being used with a breast biopsy phantom simulator. You can see the needle here going down into the simulated breast polyp. And on the right-hand side was the simulated system, again with a spherical target, and then the little dot here is where this virtual needle was intersecting the target. So by changing what was displayed in the background properties in this virtual ultrasound simulator, we were able to look at exactly what controlled user performance with the sonic flashlight. All right, so that was the situation circa sort of fall 2006 when I was starting the data collection portion of my research. And I had to make the decision at that point whether I wanted to go a more conventional job route or whether I wanted to do a startup company. I had an interview with Google in Pittsburgh in 2006. Their office at that point had only been open for about a year. And I thought I had been relatively clear with them that I don't have a CS degree. In fact, my undergrad degrees were in bioengineering and philosophy, which would not ordinarily qualify one to work at Google. But for some reason, they gave me an interview with about the results that you would expect talking to a philosophy major. And as I was walking out the door, got a call from Mike from MICA, who's my current business partner, who at that point was about 4 months out of selling his company, Assistware, which he was the CEO at, and which had way back in the mid-90s been co-founded by Todd Yoakum and Dean Pomerleau, who were both also RI alumni. Dean was actually the thesis advisor for Todd. There's a complicated backstory to their relationship that resulted in Dean actually being in charge of Assistware, which had a device called the SafeTrack, which came out of a nav lab project called Hands Free Across America. That's a complicated backstory to say that Mike had, at this point, been the CEO of Assistware for a couple of years. They were acquired by a large machine vision company called Cognex, and then subsequently acquired by a trucking company called Takata. And this is a lane departure warning system that would mount in the cockpit of an extremely heavy tractor trailer so that when they were falling asleep after being on the road for 20 hours, it would make this little chirping sound and encourage you to get back on the road so you didn't kill some family in a minivan. So Mike, at this point, was getting antsy. He had 2 young kids at that point, was getting tired of being at home with them, I guess, and decided that he needed to do another startup company. And as I was walking out the door from the Google interview, called me and said, hey, do you want to come start a company to commercialize the sonic flashlight? And I was like, yeah, of course, why not? So that's how I ended up in the startup culture. Now you'll notice that I don't have sonic flashlights sitting up here. So the explanation as to why I have 3D scanners up here and not sonic flashlights is in fact the entire rest of this talk. There are two general routes to doing startup companies. This is about the bootstrapping approach. Hopefully, you'll draw positive conclusions. If you draw negative conclusions out of this talk, I don't know that I would necessarily blame you. There are very different philosophies as to what you want out of a startup company. If you are a fan of the movie The Social Network and decide that what you really want is thousands of people frantically working together in deluxe office space, bootstrapping is probably not the approach that you want. If you're trying to keep equity in the company so that when you sell it, you can exit for a cheaper amount, bootstrapping is probably a little bit more up your alley. So the idea with bootstrapping a startup, as opposed to running out and immediately raising venture capital, is you get minimal dilutive investment. You focus on a quick path to shipping product and getting revenue in and becoming revenue positive as quickly as possible. Focus on your compensation primarily being sweat equity, which is a fancy way of saying you don't pay yourself, or you do pay yourself, but not market rate. And then live cheaply. And part of that is our wonderfully deluxe office space up in Gibsonia. We've now since moved onto the top floor, which looks a little bit less like a hair salon, but I can't say is necessarily higher quality space. If you are in the market for startup space, the real estate market commercially is priced differently than it is for houses. So you'll see a number like $7 a square foot, which is I think what we pay for our space. And that is the amount per square foot of space per year, which you then have to multiply out and divide if you want to actually get to the rent. 7 is extremely cheap. So 7 is usually considered what's called Class C or Class B warehouse space. So the fact that we're in an office for $7 a square foot is extremely cheap. That said, if you are in a startup, you will quickly develop an appreciation of exactly how far $1 million does not go when you're talking about adding up, keeping the lights on, keeping the heat on, paying for the square footage, paying for a minimal salary with health insurance, and so on. So this is why you tend to focus on space like this as opposed to particularly posh digs. So we immediately ran into the issue of, well, we're bootstrapping. We're not going to take a huge amount of upfront dilutive investment, so how do we pay the bills? The way we decided to pay the bills was to do some contract work for a project that was a joint venture from CMU and Pitt for a system for diagnosing and tracking rheumatoid arthritis. If you're not familiar with it, it's an autoimmune disease. It's one that's actually depressingly common. It's about a 1% overall incidence rate, more commonly in women than men. And most commonly presents in middle age, but juvenile rheumatoid arthritis also exists. The medicines that are used to treat RA are extremely nasty, since it is an autoimmune disease. The way that it's predominantly treated is with immune suppressive drugs, which come with the obvious side effects of depressing your immune system. So they want to make sure that the dosage on them is as little as possible. To that end, there are a surprising lack of metrics to actually quantify disease progression with rheumatoid arthritis. And the idea, which came out of a 2005 paper, which I have a slide up of in a second, was to use a combination of 3D scanning and thermography, 3D scanning being able to measure the swelling and therefore joint volume increase, and with the well-known correlation between pain and inflammation and joint temperature, measuring that with thermal imaging. And Rafi Hirsch, who was at the Children's Hospital running their pediatric rheumatology program, I think, and who is now the head of the hospital at the University of Iowa, had proposed combining 3D and thermal imaging to create what they called a arthritic index to track the disease progression here. So the idea being, of course, with these very toxic drugs, that you get a patient in, baseline their drug requirement at time 0, and then track their response to the drug as the treatment progresses so that you can keep them on as low a dose as possible of the medicine. At the time, they were using, so this box here is a KONICA Minolta Vivid 910, which is a 3D scanner that is available from, unsurprisingly, KONICA Minolta. It is a color scanner, so the camera lens up here actually has a color wheel behind it, so you can get a color 3D texture in addition to the 3D scan. There's a laser that's emitted from the lower aperture. And then this is a camera, cooled microbolometer thermal camera. I think it was made by a company called Metatherm. And so that would look down on the patient's hand, capture a thermal image looking down, and then they would do a 3D scan, wheel the 3D scanner around the other side of the patient and capture the view from the other side, and then stitch those together, map the thermal on, and look for statistical changes. And this is where they were at circa 2006. So they got hooked up with Mike and I through a couple of the local economic tech development groups because they knew that I came out of the RI and figured I might have heard of a 3D scanner, which of course at the time I hadn't, but was quite willing to tell them that of course we work with 3D scanners all the time. I'd be happy to take a look at it for you. And then frantically went home and Googled for what a 3D scanner was. There was obvious room for improvement here. They had only one 3D scanner, which had to be manually moved around the patient, literally on a tripod. That made the system sort of conference room sized because you had to have a desk set up and then grab the 3D scanner, wheel it around, and then look at it from the other side. And the thermal scan was very slow. This was not a mil-spec 3D, or not a mil-spec thermal scanner, so it took about 20 seconds to actually capture the rastered image. There was also, and this was an issue that never really got resolved even by 2011, which is when our involvement with the project ended, which was an assumption of repeatable patient fixation. In other words, that their hand was completely immobile during the entire procedure, and that if they came back 3 months later, that their hand ended up in the same spot for purposes of doing delta measurements. So we got involved with this, took a look at it, and the KONICA Minolta pricing at the time was about $45,000 for the 3D scanner, and they, with their price target for what they were hoping to go to market with this device was such that they couldn't possibly tolerate two $45,000 scanners in the same device. We got about 2 months into this, doing some studies looking at different manufacturer options. I started working with a company based out of Massachusetts who had a $7,000 scanner and unfortunately 12-week lead times. So this got us to the point of early October in 2007, really having to basically sit on our hands. There wasn't a whole lot that we could do until these two 3D scanners that we had ordered from Massachusetts were going to come in. And idle hands are where 3D scanners come from. I went back last night to try to figure out when exactly the first date was, and as far as I can tell, it was on October 5th in 2007, where I made the extremely tired comment, if we can get to this point with some really half-assed math, digital SLR, a laser line level, I think we're onto something. And this was in fact where the first 3D scanner came from. Mike had a deck project in his backyard that he'd been working on, so he brought his laser line level in. I had been a little bit of a photography geek in grad school, but the digital SLR was sitting around collecting dust. And we hooked all this stuff up on a tripod where we could sort of crank the laser by hand and move this laser line over a target, which in this case, if you really squint at this, you can kind of see that it's a Starbucks cup lid. So that's the depression that you drink out of and this little indent up top. And this was, if you recognize the checkerboard here, which is the sort of famous OpenCV camera calibration checkerboard, this was the Starbucks cup lid taped onto a OpenCV camera cal checkerboard. So this was the very first laser scanner that I built, and that was in October of 2007. This is obviously the sort of scanner that you build if you've never built a laser scanner before. Normally you don't think of hand cranking a laser, but we like to take the sort of manual approach to it early on. Coincidentally, I feel like this story is full of these sort of, and the very next day something else happened. At the time, Pitt, who we were negotiating the patent license with on the sonic flashlight, had a very confrontational tech transfer department. They have since improved somewhat, but for those of you who are CMU students as opposed to also students elsewhere, CMU is much, much easier to work with than Pitt. At the time, Pitt's tech transfer department had a series of extremely stringent requirements that I'm not going to go into, but that ended up blowing up that licensing deal. So within very short order, about 6 months after I graduated, the thing that I thought I was going to be commercializing and building, we now no longer had a patent license to actually build, which would seem like a problem. But then the very next day, we did another mock-up, this time with a motor instead of the hand crank, with a hand model, and then actually demonstrated to ourselves that we could actually take reasonable looking scans of hands, that maybe there was a path forward here to not rely on the Massachusetts people with the horrible lead time. So the object lesson for us with this was, if at all possible, ship product to your customers before they have the chance to shop around and or invent the thing that you're trying to sell to them. And that worked out well for us, probably not so well for them. So this was the first 3D scanner application that we had that actually worked in this very nebulous definition of working. So over the course of the fall 2007, we started to actually refine what we were doing. We initially got very excited thinking that we had invented a cheap way to build 3D laser scanners. And the little stick here that you can see in the 3D scan, and not so much over here. If you're familiar with, anybody have seen the David laser scanner project out of Europe? Okay, there's a very homebrew project that came out of an independent reinvention of a Caltech paper from the late 90s by Jean-Yves Boguet called 3D scanning on your desk. The idea was that you could have a laser line shining into a corner cube and track the position of the laser based on where you observe the corner cube. We had a similar idea, which was that if we just had a reference object in the view of the 3D scanner, in this case this vertical plane, that would allow us to solve for the position of the laser as it was moving without having to actively control it, and therefore allow us to save money during the scan process. As it turns out, there's not a whole lot of money in building extremely cheap 3D scanners, so this ended up not surviving our business model review when we got further into the process of going through that. But this did allow us to eventually work on the next generation prototype for the arthritis system. So this was a military grade FLIR, an uncooled thermal camera, standard machine vision camera, and then a laser attached to, at this point, a DC gearbox. DC gearboxes are not the right tool for precision panning of a laser, but at least at this point in the project, worked well enough for us. We then moved on to a stepper prototype. If anybody ever wants to manually drive a stepper motor from a parallel port by writing a crazy series of byte codes to the Windows parallel port, I can tell you how to do that. So we had this dual stepper axis driver that I hacked out of a parallel port cable until we realized, of course, that you can spend $200 on a perfectly good smart motor that does the same thing 5,000 times better. In any case, this was 2 actual independent scan heads, again, using the OpenCV checkerboard. This was the first rig that actually allowed us to do hand scans. After, as you might imagine, substantially more polish, we arrived at the Generation 2 prototype. So this was circa early 2008, I think April-ish, give or take. So this had an industrial PC embedded into a cart. The entire system was mounted on the cart. The thermal camera and the top color camera view aren't visible up here. And then we had 2 internal line laser scanners that used still that reference plane idea. So they used this raised sort of truncated pyramid as the reference surface for pulling the laser off of to get a more accurate model of the laser motion than trying to actually track the stepper progress. So this back one, there's no lens on this because we never actually used the rear scanner in this setup. We just used the left and the right scanners. There was a mirror here, a actual machine vision grade laser line generator, and then the 2 imaging source FireWire cameras. So the patient would sit there, stick their arm into the little cavern here. You'd have a live viewfinder where you could line your hand up with the ideal hand location and then take a scan here. Obviously, at this point, I said that hand fixation continued to be somewhat of a perennial problem with this project. At this point, there really wasn't much of a hand fixation attempt at all. This was more of a proof of concept to show that we could actually do laser scanning. So for about $20,000 less than the cost of just one of the KONICA Minolta scanners, we were able to produce an entire embedded device that included 3 or 2 active 3D scanners and the thermal camera. Results from this, even for these early prototypes, were actually pretty decent. So this is a hand scan. You can see here the overlap of the left and the right hand scanners is pretty decent. We've since gotten better. But the volume measurements that we derived from this were actually quite good. We had some artifacts that we built by generating very small, precise blobs of clay onto a substrate where we could then model the rise in the substrate as a result of applying the clay and recover volume changes to within about 1/10 of a milliliter, which for this project was actually pretty decent. Depending on your needs, obviously, you might have to go more or less complicated than that. You could add color overlay. This is a little dark here, but this is a 3D model that you could spin around and see the color texture on the hand. And then more interestingly, you could also map the thermal onto that. We had a way of calibrating the thermal camera by actually printing out again, the OpenCV checkerboard on a laser printer, and then hitting it with an IR lamp so that the toner would emit black body radiation from the carbon and the white paper would not. And that would allow you to calibrate the thermal camera using the IR sensor as opposed to the visible light. So we started thinking at this point that we actually had a fairly price competitive scanner. The quality, given the price, was actually quite good. We are still, and this is surprising to this day, one of the only companies that does OEM laser scanner manufacturing. If you're not familiar with the word, OEM means that you build something for someone else who then markets the device. So in this case, we're building the laser scanners that go inside this device that was not our invention. So we scrapped the original plans, again, because the Sonic Flashlight license fell through and decided to respin the company in early 2008 as a 3D scanner company, thinking at this point that we had 3D scanners completely figured out. So just to go back to a little bit where the money comes from, there's a bunch of different levels that you can choose to take money at as a startup. The most aggressive and most famous level of this, of course, is venture capital, and that involves someone giving you a sum of money in exchange for a percentage of the company. The obvious question then is how you decide which percentage of the company they're buying, because your argument is that you're worth infinity money, and therefore you should take their $1 million and not owe them anything. Their argument is that you're a bunch of yahoos in a $7 square foot office and you're worth nothing, and therefore they should take the whole thing. And you have to kind of negotiate and arrive at a figure where they're not taking the entire company and you're not getting nothing in exchange for it. And that's a hard problem, actually, a surprisingly hard one, because you have to make the argument with a straight face that we don't have any sales or technology or employees, but you should give us $1 million and only take whatever number you'd like, 20% of the company. And that is referred to as the valuation. So if you hear somebody talking about the valuation for their startup, that is the number that you're taking the percentage of for the selling. So if you have a $5 million valuation and someone gives you $1 million, you've sold 20% of the company. And the game with this is always that typically the founders want to keep controlling interest in the company, and the VCs definitely do not want you as an ex-academic to have controlling interest in anything with money attached to it. They would like to have the ability to stick their own CEO in it. For a variety of reasons, not least of which was not being able to make that argument, that we couldn't plausibly say at this point that we had a valuation of X where X was large enough to get a percentage of money coming in that made sense. A lot of startups start at either the angel investor level or at the government economic development level. We started at this level. Angel investors are VCs who aren't rich enough to be VCs. They typically will loan you money on slightly more generous terms. So they'll give you $100,000, and instead of taking a percentage of the company, they'll take what's called a convertible note, which means that at the point when you go to sell the company or do something else, at that point the $100,000 gets rolled into the valuation of the company at that point, and they'll take either a percentage of the company or just take their money back with interest. But we went the route of working with both the Idea Foundry and Tech Collaborative in Pittsburgh. Tech Collaborative unfortunately no longer exists and is part of Innovation Works. Idea Foundry will give you a block of money, and then they also give you an in-kind match of brain power, so you can pick their brains on how you want to set the company up, what your market strategy should be, and they were instrumental in convincing us that no, there's not really a huge market in only making $200 per scanner, and convinced us to go for somewhat higher target for the price. Tech Collaborative was in the business of funding economic development goals, so they would pay you a certain amount of money for a research project, and then give rights to that to other members of the Tech Collaborative organization. And then they had their parent goal as being creating a certain number of jobs as a result of spending a certain amount of money. So if you hear about the current political debates about job creation, that's things like the Tech Collaborative. And like I said, unfortunately they're no longer around, but Innovation Works is and does something quite similar. The last, and I absolutely do not suggest ever doing this, and I'm very glad that I did not do it personally. You hear stories about how someone started in their garage and invested all their life savings and mortgaged their house. That often does not work out well. And if you have as a bottom line that you're not going to go into this, then you don't run the risk of personally bankrupting yourself when you are one of the 4 startups who fails in the first year and not the lucky 5th startup who succeeds. I'm glad I didn't do this. I did pull my personal savings down farther than I would like, but I did not actually run up personal credit card debt to build 3D scanners. So the idea that we had with this was that we had been working with laser line stripe scanners. The idea with laser line stripe is that you just have a single laser line that marches across the object, and you then have a camera that looks at it and you can triangulate through from the camera focal point through the image plane and back out onto the device where the laser is illuminating it. There's an alternative approach that's used in white light scanning quite a bit called space-time coding. The idea with this is you can reduce the effective count of images that you have to project by actually providing a spatial variation in addition to a temporal variation of what you're projecting. So you project at time 1 half black and half white, at time 2 black, white, and so on, as far down as you want to go and maintain this binary coding pattern. So the idea that we started developing in 2008 was to do a laser-based structured light system where we had a rastering laser that would turn on and off to form these space-time coding patterns. So this is one frame of this pattern, say the most detailed pattern here, and that would vary through time. This led over the course of 2008 to what we called the SL1, which was the cleverly named Structured Light 1 laser scanner, which was this rather unprofessional in retrospect looking mess. So we had a color filter wheel here with a machine vision camera, a galvanometer that would wiggle a mirror back and forth under control of a little microprocessor, and then some very haphazard wiring on the back here. And this allowed us to project a series of time-varying laser patterns and then capture those with the camera, analyze it, and form a 3D scan. So this was launched in February of 2009 at a trade show called Medical Design and Manufacturing in California, for which I managed to somehow get a stomach bug and arrived extremely ill and had to demo 3D scanners not having eaten in 3 days. So this is our booth there. The 3D scanner is sort of perched over on the desktop here. We decided to crate up the ARTHRITIS scanner and take it out with us as a demo of the OEM projects. Unsurprisingly, the market for standalone $30,000 ARTHRITIS scanners was about what you would expect. But we did have a lot of interest in the laser scanner. And this is a sample scan that we did. We're fond of buying random things from Amazon. So we have a Venus de Milo statue. We have an entire collection of dinosaurs, which is what I usually carry around for demos. So the results here, if you're familiar with 3D scanning, this is actually decent. Certainly for our price point, which is about $20,000 for the standalone scanner, represents a reasonable cost performance ratio for a 3D scanner. So this is where we were at in February of 2009. This was the case, closer up. Design of the case, which if it looks like a piece of aluminum extrusion, that's exactly what it was. So we literally just took a chop saw and hacked a piece of aluminum extrusion into a 12-inch length and stuffed the scanner assembly inside it. People who are spending $20,000 on a scanner usually expect a little bit more than a piece of aluminum extrusion. So we started a case redesign that spring and ended up with this form factor, which is the one that you see on the desk there. At this point, we didn't actually have the guts that would fit inside this because we were switching camera technologies. Nonetheless, we went to SIGGRAPH in 2009 and took both the actual working scanner and the mock-up of the scanner with us. If you ever see demos where someone just has something on a turntable sort of slowly spinning, what they've probably done is what we did, which was to mask off the camera with something shiny so it looked like there was a camera inside it, and stick a laser aimed straight at the center of the turntable so that if someone looked at it, it was like, oh, it's scanning. See, it's rotating in a circle. And they're like, woo, laser scanner. So this actually wasn't even working at the time, but nonetheless, you can see we had it in the front so people would walk by and think that we were scanning alligator heads. This is in New Orleans, which is why we had all the alligators. And this one was working, but this one was not. It's important with startups to always be safety conscious. We had linear power supplies that we were using at the time, which we took to the show exactly like this. It's a little exciting to have small kids running around your booth with their feet possibly kicking into about 1,000 volts of linear power supply. So we wrapped these in cardboard boxes to be safety conscious. That had the interesting side effect actually of providing enough insulation that they would constantly thermally overload. So we had 2 of them with us, and we'd have to crawl around the floor and swap out the linear power supplies as they overloaded and allow them to cool off. At one point they got hot enough that it transferred a piece of copy paper onto my laptop power supply because it was hot enough to actually transfer the toner off of the copy paper. So anyway, safety first. As a reality check, and this is probably the single largest lesson that I have from startups, getting 95% of the way there is very easy. And in fact, you'll look at it and say, well, we're 95% of the way there. How hard can it possibly be to finish the last 5% of the project? And in fact, the final 5% of this occupied the entire rest of 2009. So building the scanner, inventing the entire technology took me about 3 weeks of long hours over Christmas. And then the entire rest of 2009 was spent fixing all the problems that the 3 weeks had introduced. So before we had this delicious mess where we had a consumer USB hub that we had disassembled and stuck inside the scanner because we were using a USB scanner. We had sort of Radio Shack grade wiring and a general purpose controller. After we actually had a completely custom Atmel-based controller with a custom DAC board arrangement, wiring bundles that actually made some sort of sense, and a case that was actually drilled and tapped appropriately so that it looked like something that was worth the price point. So over the rest of 2009, we finished up that project and started assembling the next generation of the ARTHRITIS system in 2010. And I had the unfortunate experience of both refining the existing design for the scanner so it would fit, and then also launching the first OEM product. So we were simultaneously developing the SDK and parts assembly for the OEM line while we were developing the standalone box line, so that made for an extremely interesting January. But this is the system we ended up with that project total. So we had a laser printer so you could print out a little takeaway for the patients, a heads-up display so they could watch where their hand was being positioned, and then a laptop that went along with this, and a nice power supply and Ethernet switch assembly in there. These ended up, and this is true of the current scanner as well, being gigabit Ethernet based because we could pass RS-232 command signals through the Ethernet cameras to control the guts of the galvo and laser assembly. This is a closer up of the scanner, and that's the same model that's here with an additional 2 years of software improvements to it. The physician interface for this one was much more refined than the initial prototype, so we let people have both left and the right hands visible, automatically aligned it. We had some patient management stuff with databasing, so that you log off the hands of the patients that went through the system. And the most interesting piece in this has ended up being useful in our most recent project that I'll talk about at the end, was a development of a 3D splatting technique to actually take the height data and project it back down to the underlying reference plane so that you could pull off something like a topo map. If you've worked with 3D data, actually pulling metrics out of the 3D data is still sort of an open research project for a lot of people. And we didn't want to deal with that, so we actually splatted everything back down to a 2.5D height map, and then you can measure volumes by just throwing a reference shape around it, looking at how the heights add up inside that volume. And this ended up actually being a very useful piece of code to have developed, like I said, because it is used in our most recent product. In SIGGRAPH 2010, we took the actually very odd step of deciding to do live demos on the show floor. So we sent out a flyer ahead of time saying, hey, bring your part by, sign up for a 1-hour slot, and we'll do a live scan to show you that we're not just using canned demos for the scanner. So we had people bringing all sorts of stuff by. Crucially, we had a 3D turntable. So this is a turntable that's under control of the 3D scanner where it can index the part around and do the scan automatically. This became important because this generated one of the first huge math crises that I've ever had. And this was in the fall of 2010, where the number of scans that we had accumulated at SIGGRAPH made it very clear that the calibration was not nearly as good as we thought it was. Up to this point, we had been calibrating using a fixed rig, where we went through with a micrometer gauge and actually set pieces of this rig so that when you assembled the scanner on the rig, everything would come out with the right alignment. As it turns out, when you're working with 3D scanner stuff, because of the lever arm effect, even micron level changes in the assembly have an extremely large impact as a result of the lever arm going out into space. So this rig, which was assembled to about 20 micron precision, ended up actually not being remotely adequate for doing actual calibrations to the scanner, which was unfortunate because that led us to ask the question whether we even knew what we were doing at all with 3D scanning. Also at this point, the bootstrapping approach sort of came back to bite us because we ran out of money. So we still had enough in the bank to keep the company going and going to trade shows and building product, but this was the start of not paying ourselves for 14 months, which grad school had fortunately conditioned me quite well for. And it turns out that as long as you maintain your grad student lifestyle, you can survive an awful lot in the startup world. Fortunately, in January of 2011, we negotiated a partnership with KONICA and Minolta, the same people, ironically, who we were trying to replace because they were too expensive. This partnership is ongoing, so we have a product that we private labeled through them called the Virtuoso, which still is just the box on the table. And we occupy now the sub $45,000 price point in their product line. It has not been remarkably lucrative, but has brought with it some side referrals that have actually let us keep going. So this was signed in January in 2011. We, at that point in time, largely scrapped our own marketing effort because KONICA has a very nice existing sales infrastructure, and the cut that they took of the unit more than offset the fact that we no longer had to worry about going out and trying to sell it by ourselves. So it's really hard to put too much of a positive spin on 2011. It was really a pretty awful year. Like I said, the entire calendar year had not gotten paid. We did invent a macro version of this where we used a very fine laser line to the point where you can resolve details on the scale of the surface of a penny. I also like this because this is how much I made in 2011. I do encourage you to keep this in mind, that if you do take the bootstrapping approach, you are keeping equity in the company, but there is the very legitimate question of whether you're keeping equity in a treehouse or whether you'd rather own 5% of Google. A lot of people would rather take the 5% of Google, which is why people take venture capital money. It doesn't prevent you from getting into the place where you can't pay yourself, but it makes it much less likely, in exchange, obviously, for having to give up control of the company. Part of the reason why we ended up in this financial position was that we had hoped to close an investment round in April of 2011, and that slipped to August, then that slipped to December, and finally we were able to close the investment round in time for Christmas, which was a nice Christmas present. This is a lesson I think that I have now taken to heart, which is that people are always much less eager to give you money than they are to take it themselves. So in our case, we were very interested in receiving the money, but the investors were much more interested in doing the proper due diligence. That did eventually come through, so we got back into the ability to pay ourselves in approximately November of 2011. Since then, things have actually really turned around, so there is a happy ending to this story. So in January of 2012, we got a contract with Microsoft to build them an ear scanner. We asked what it was for, and they said they couldn't tell us. So then I flew out there to do a design review and said, okay, well, give me an NDA, and I'll sign the NDA, and then you can tell me what it's for. So I signed the NDA and said, okay, what's it for? They said, oh, we still can't tell you. We just want you to sign this NDA. So to this day, I still have no idea what this is used for. Hopefully, it's nothing nefarious. They were interested in extremely precise measurements of ears. Again, I have no idea why. I hope it's for the Windows Phone and not earbugs like out of the Matrix. So this is Mike modeling for us. So we had a little telescoping chin rest that would allow you to position the head, and then these 6 scanners that all shared a common focus, which we had some fun days blinding ourselves with little ping pong balls, lining up all 6 scanners so they would hit at the same focus point. This is bigger than it looks like, so to minimize vibrations, this is a 1-inch thick steel, or 1-inch thick aluminum plate that was cut and then mounted onto a steel base, and this framework is bolted down into it. So it's pretty solid. As we discovered, it's also taller than our door frame. So when FedEx came to pick it up, we ended up having to actually take the thing apart and then reassemble it in the parking lot on a pallet. And fortunately, we were having that warm spell back in January, and we were able to actually work in short sleeves out in the parking lot in sunny weather, which for Pittsburgh is unusual, so we took that as a positive sign. I flew out to Microsoft to install this because they were extremely antsy to get it. Got out there, and no one knew who I was or why I was coming, which was an interesting experience given that they had insisted that I'd be out the following Monday. And got out there and discovered that it had been dumped by the shipping company at the bottom of a wheelchair access ramp because they had decided to stick it in this room that had a raised floor. So you actually had to go and turn 90 degrees to the left, go up this wheelchair ramp, do a 180 with something that weighs about 400 pounds, and then come back up the other direction. Again, I wish I knew what this was used for. It was kind of a cool device to work on, and actually let us get a little bit ahead of ourselves financially so that we could do some other things. And that leads to where we're at finally as of right now. When we were doing the investor pitch for Innovation Works, who provided the funding round last December, we had identified this sort of pyramid. Everybody's fond of pyramids when you're doing investor pitches. And at the bottom, we identified that, well, all right, so there's this sort of market where you can sell one $100,000 3D scanner to Ford. And the next step up is that you can sell 10 $20,000 3D scanners to graphics artists who are trying to scan clay maquettes for visual effects industry. And then there's this other application that we think exists somewhere where you can sell $1,000, $2,000 3D scanners a year to someone, but we have no idea who they are. It turns out that the someone is this company in Virginia called Foot Levelers, who we've now been in a partnership with for about the last 8 months. And they are a company that does orthotics. So if you have back pain, you go see a chiropractor or a general practitioner, they may suggest that you get a shoe insert like this. The idea with it is not so much that the shoe insert necessarily corrects the problem itself, but what it does is cause you to change your posture. It's sort of the princess and the pea idea. So you stick something in your shoe that causes you to roll your foot slightly left or right, and it can actually do quite a bit. There's some nerve problems that pop up pretty commonly, bunions, calluses, things like that, where it doesn't seem like an insole could actually do a whole lot. But I was skeptical enough that when I was in to see my doctor over the summer, I asked him what he thought about about it, and he's a pretty laconic guy, and even he agreed that he likes orthotics, which made me feel a little bit less guilty. There is an element of working in the chiropractic space that I have to say, coming from a scientific background, it's a little hand wavy with magnets and magic rays, but at least in this kind of space, I've managed to satisfy myself that I'm not selling a product that's too morally questionable. So they had been working for quite some time with a flatbed scanner, like literally a scanner that they built a housing for from HP that you would step on so they could scan the bottom of your foot. And they used that as a replacement for foam casting kits, which they held the patent on for a number of years. If you've ever had orthotics made, there are two general ways that it's done. One is with plaster casting, so that you sit on a chair, they wrap your foot with plaster. The other is you step in this thing that looks like sort of a fancy florist box where they stick flowers in it, and it crushes the foam down and lets you pull measurements of the foot from the foam box. The problem with foam boxes is that shipping actually in a low margin industry becomes sort of the dominant price driver. So if you're talking about shipping a piece of foam to someone, having them step in it, and then shipping the foam box back, that's actually $10 that's simply waste in the supply chain. So their big innovation in the late 90s was starting to use flatbed scanners, where they would, instead of having you step on the foam box, have you step on this flatbed scanner and take a 2D picture of the bottom of your foot, pull the measurements from that, and then build the orthotic based on the pressure points that the doctor had identified. So they called us in February, wanted to know if we could build a foot scanner. In our long history of agreeing to things that we had absolutely no idea how to do, agreed to do this, and then came in over the weekend and built this, which was a camera and laser mounted on a ball screw that we ordered off of eBay, controlled with one of the motors that we use for driving the little rotary stages. This was to show them how fast the processing time was. So that was the prototype that we got done in 72 hours. Before they came up, we did stick it under a piece of glass so you could actually stand on it and scan your foot. After a bit of refinement, we arrived at this design, which to a certain extent is actually what's used in the commercial product over there, where we have a laser, a mirror, and a camera mounted on a friction bearing. So this is an aluminum extrusion that has like a high molecular weight polyethylene slider that goes back and forth in it. A stepper motor that drives a belt drive, and that drives this little track back and forth. This is a set of LEDs for doing white light illumination at the bottom of the foot. And this was grafted at this point onto one of their old case bottoms just so we had something to work with. This was one of the first foot scans that came off. I've gotten a little bit immune to seeing the bottoms of feet. It turns out you see an awful lot of them if you're in the foot scanning business. I'm happy to say that I have a very normal looking bottom of my foot. There are some strange feet out there. After 3 months of polish, we ended up at the unit that you see over here. So it actually has a full polycarbonate top that's back painted. There's a little logo down at the end that illuminates when the LEDs get down to the far end. It has a thermoformed bottom case on it that has been the bane of our existence for the entire summer. And we're actually building the entire kit and caboodle up in Gibsonia. So there's no outsourced manufacturing except for the sub-assemblies. We're actually doing all the final assembly up in Gibsonia proper. This is a little dark here, but the final data results look like something like this. So this is my hand. This color is actually splatted using the same technique as the height map from the arthritis stuff from 2 years ago. That allows us to crop out all the background. So even though this was done in a room that had fluorescent lights above us, because we can mask out the color data depending on the 3D data, and because the 3D data is actually much more noise rejecting than the color, we're able to crop the color data to fit the 3D. And then co-located with all this, so if you toggle back and forth between the two, there's a one-to-one correspondence between the height map that comes off the laser, and this is how they can pull measurements for, say, the arch for their orthotic, and the color, which is what makes patients happy to see. So there was an obvious manufacturing challenge. For a long time, we had been sort of what I would describe as a boutique manufacturer, where we would do anywhere from 5 to 15 scanners a year, depending on the exact profit margin of what we were doing. And suddenly we're faced with a company that placed a blanket order for 1,200 of these for the next calendar year. And scaling from 10 to 15 of something to 1,200 was a challenge that I had not fully anticipated the magnitude of. When the first semi-truck arrived, and this is 100 cases, so 1 month's worth of cases, we had to move all the furniture out of our conference room, which has since turned into our assembly room, and also we had to fill up the entire kitchen with boxes. So now there's not a whole lot of space left to even walk around, but we do have the manufacturing set up. We're frantically trying to move out of the space that we're in into a more full-fledged manufacturing facility. And like I said, ramping up production has been a very, very interesting experience. This represents more scanners than we had sold to date as of yesterday, and this was the number of scanners that were on the shelf yesterday being prepped for putting into cases. We have a room dedicated entirely to just burning these systems in so that we can catch failures before they ship. And again, this would typically represent the number of scanners that we would have shipped in several months' time, much less a single afternoon. And this was one run of the 3 runs of burn-in that we had going that day. So it has been a very, very different experience. I don't know if there's anything about a PhD that makes you remotely qualified to be involved in designing a manufacturing process, but that is nonetheless where I found myself. So moving forwards, we have projected shipments of at least 1,200 scanners in the next 12 months, which has made us frantic for moving into a new facility. We have another scanner design that's in the works for January launch that I unfortunately can't talk a whole lot about, but it is in the foot product line. We've made 2 full-time hires in the past 2 months, and we're making a 3rd probably next week to take up some of the manufacturing load. I am fortunate that Mike has been through all this before with the AssistWare project for ramping up production for the safe tracks, so I don't have to be the genius, and has really improved my understanding of why industrial engineering is a field. When I was at Pitt, we called them imaginary engineers because we didn't understand what they do. Now I have a very firm appreciation of why production design is its own field. All right, so I think this is the point where I should give some sage advice. The economic development route was good for us. If you can get SBIRs, STTRs, or DOT or DOD contracts, great. We did not. In particular, SBIRs and STTRs don't come with strings attached, generally speaking. If you take DOT or DOD money, there often are deliverable requirements that can generate something of an endless cycle, which for a company is not healthy. For academics, it's a grant, but for a company, if you can't get out of this spiral, it's very hard to build value in the company. That said, a very important lesson for me is that we were undercapitalized for the period of 2010 to 2011. There's no way around it. The sensible thing to do in retrospect would have been to sell off a portion of the company at that point in exchange for bringing in some more money. We had some very good momentum coming out of the 2 SIGGRAPHs, which I feel like we squandered to a certain extent. Now, there was another problem kind of going on with all of this, and I strongly encourage you, if at all possible, if you control, say, the government or the world economy, to not launch your startup into the midst of a recession, which complicated our fundraising to a large degree, and that was part of what was causing all of those delays in 2011 with the economic development stuff, is that suddenly there were a lot more people clamoring for a piece of a much smaller pie. I don't know how you avoid this, honestly, other than to make sure that you're not getting yourself into a situation where you're living hand to mouth if the funding doesn't come in. As an academic, the advice that I would give to anybody is that you are not an accountant and you are not a lawyer. I say that in all seriousness. You are definitely not either of these things. We've had an accountant involved with us from the very beginning, and it is extremely important. It's often said that accountants pay for themselves, and that's completely true. There are all sorts of tax credits and things that you're eligible for as a small business that I would not have even been remotely comfortable filing for myself. And then second, for the IP side of things, although as an academic you will be responsible for working with a lawyer to write patent stuff and all those kinds of filings, it is very important that the stuff be phrased correctly for it to be worth anything at all, and make sure you get a lawyer involved with you earlier rather than later. Realize that science is not the hardest part of the problem when you're in industry. It's the first problem, but problems 2 through 1,000 are typically manufacturing related, and you don't have necessarily a huge amount to offer there, so be humble. The very first thing I did with my PhD upon graduation was cleaning a toilet. So just make sure that you're not going out with an attitude. Typically, if you're working with a company where you have someone who is experienced in business, they are worth more than you are, and keep that in mind. That doesn't mean you're not valuable, and it's important to stick up for yourself as well. Industry people have much less respect for academics than you would probably guess. They think that we're here wasting our time, getting expensive educations and not learning anything. You did actually acquire all the knowledge that's in your product, and then you're responsible for that, so make sure that you stand up for yourself if things seem to be heading in an alternative direction. As a grad student, and this is, I guess, the piece of advice that I would have as to why you should consider doing this now. As a grad student, you're used to living lean, working hard and keeping your own hours. All those things are very compatible with startups. I don't have a set schedule, which is why I'm here today. If I feel like taking a day off and sitting on the couch and drinking beer and playing a game, I'll do that and then work at night. to a certain extent, you can have as much or as little vacation as you want. I have found out, actually, that ends up being more in the little direction, because the idea of paid vacation in a startup is completely an oxymoron. You can have as much vacation as you want, and you can pay yourself. That doesn't necessarily accomplish anything if you do that. For me, the transition to a startup is very easy. I tend to like these kinds of things and place a higher value on them than necessarily having a huge paycheck. Do keep in mind that you are probably giving up an academic career if you pursue startup lifestyle. I don't think there's anything about what I've done in the last 5 years that makes me qualified in the slightest extent to go back and pick up research full time. But that said, don't let anybody talk you into doing a traditional industrial career under the argument that that somehow prevents you from doing a startup or vice versa. You can certainly do a startup and then go work for Google or Microsoft or whoever. And finally, what I get out of it is this. I like, personally, looking at something where I was an idiot 5 years ago, cranking a laser line level by hand, and getting up to the point where we are ramping production up to 1,200 units of something a year. It's not a route that I expected to have happen, and I think that it has probably made me a better person, if I want to get a little smarmy about it. That said, purely from an intellectual interest, I like being able to see the entire flow. I like the idea going from first principles science all the way through actually shipping something out the door. And if you like this kind of thing, give startups a try. I would strongly suggest getting somebody more experienced than you involved from the beginning. I was very fortunate that Mike had been through 2 startups, both successfully, when I joined up with him. And I guess that's it. Any questions? Chris.
So I was in the mall recently, and there was a big box that would have scanned me and told me what clothes fit. And I was thinking, okay, where do you make the money there? And it seems to me the service part of this, rather than the making stuff part of this, is where the real action might be. Processing the data and essentially making a Photoshop for this kind of data.
Right.
And I was wondering what your thoughts on that were, and whether you thought of, should I just be a software guy?
We have certainly considered it. That's a hard problem. There are people who have tried to do automated point cloud processing with varying degrees of success in the last 20 years. The gold standard right now is that the 3D scanning process itself is much less hands-on than it used to be. So actually acquiring the data is largely a hands-off process that's been solved by software. And the gold standard is what's called design intent modeling. So if I have some widget that I filled out of a car engine and I want to scan it and make a copy of that, it helps a lot to have a skilled engineer looking at it and say, well, the 3D scanner has measured this as 20.005 millimeters, and that's because it oxidized on the surface, and not to be too literal with the processing. And that continues to be actually a pretty big challenge in that space. Is it's very easy to scan something in nanometer precision now, and whether or not nanometers mean something in the context of producing a useful 3D model out the other end is not a problem that the industry has really been able to solve to this point. The other issue with being in the software space is that there aren't, at least at this point, enough people out there using 3D scanners to make the software cheap enough to get the kind of scaling of something like Photoshop. That is true in the general machine vision market, certainly. So companies like Cognex have been very, very successful automating 2D recognition, assembly line inspection. But so far in this space, the dollar amount tends to be high enough that you can tolerate having a human involved at this point. 100 years from now, certainly. So exactly where between now and 100 years you get useful, fully automated 3D processing, I don't know. Yeah.
Well, actually, that's a nice segue into my question, which is, where do you see yourself in 2, 5, 10 years, and so on?
So I've gotten really interested in the data sets that are coming out of the foot scanner, and have had a lot of conversations with the CIO of foot levelers about, hey, now we suddenly have, first off, we're now the either the largest or second largest manufacturer of 3D scanners in the Western Hemisphere. And as of probably the end of this year, we'll have by far and away the largest data set of feet ever assembled, which is actually much more interesting than it sounds, right? So if you're Nike and you're trying to make your shoes to fit the 95 percentile mark, it's very useful to you to know that the arch height on the average person over 100,000 people, which is not a data set that you'd ever possibly be able to get with manual measuring equipment, is a certain height. Or that, if you are 45 and male and you weigh 203 pounds, that your foot probably deforms this as compared to a 20-year-old male who weighs 170 pounds. So I've gotten very interested in the data mining side, which actually, to get back to Chris's question, is much more of a software thing. So I see this particular application as heading very much in a software direction where the hardware is as commoditized as we can make it for price reasons, and the really interesting questions get to be in sort of large-scale population demographic stuff coming off of the data that we're getting with the foot scanner. Yeah, George?
How do you get the data if you're selling the scanner?
We're in bed with them, so we're working pretty closely with their engineers.
They rent the scanners.
No, they're buying them from us, and then we're maintaining a long-term development partnership with them to keep our hands on the data sets as they move forwards. Yeah.
So Takeo's Digital Human Lab also had a foot scanner, which was doing the top of the foot as well as the bottom, and I think unloaded feet.
Right.
I have a foot scan from them to fit shoes,
Right.
which is a huge industry in the United States.
Yep.
Have you thought of going into that? Or?
We actually have worked the last couple of years with a local startup called Shoe Fitter over on Craig Street. And they have the idea that if you scan the insides of shoes, then you ask people on Zappos, what do you buy and like? And you can match up correlations between the sizes of the insides of shoes that you could make a recommendation that would reduce return rates by a certain percentage. That's how they justify their value. The problem with a lot of the clothing things is that they're not manufactured to any sort of standard that would allow you to really use high precision scanning stuff. And that's very different actually than the orthotics, which are manufactured to about a 1 millimeter precision. With shoes, even halfway decent shoes, they're built on lasts by people working at very high speed in a factory environment. And even within a particular size, you'll see up to a plus or minus 5 millimeter variation. So the idea that a scan is going to provide you useful value is probably true if the product were manufactured to that standard. So it's a bit more of a product manufacturing problem than I think a scanning problem. If the shoes go to being assembled by robots cost effectively, then I think that it would be a lot of value to scan people to fit footwear to them. But I think unless you're working in a very constrained environment like we happen to be doing with the orthotics, there's less precision in most clothing than you probably guess. Other questions? Have I kept my sanity? Sort of.
Would you do it again?
I would. I think it's a lot like a PhD. I would not choose to start this right now, knowing what I know about it. Would I choose to go back in time and tell myself to start it again at the point where I was 5 years ago? Absolutely. I think it's an interesting question, actually. Mike, my business partner, had 2 small kids when he started this company, and why on earth he did that, I have no idea. The company, not the kids. I can't imagine the workload in combination with the lack of money combined with kids. And I know several people who've done that, and I have a lot of respect for their effort, and they've pulled it off, but I would find it very difficult, I think, to have stomached the ups and downs of this with having to worry about something other than me and my wife. And she's independent enough, I don't really have to worry about her. Plus, she supported me as an English graduate student, which I have to say is quite a feat. Yeah.
So we recently had a visit from a European delegation who wanted to answer the question, how come Americans start companies, especially American graduate students start companies? And that led the faculty to think, how can we encourage our graduate students to do this kind of thing? And maybe they should be doing it before they graduate.
No, I think that would be a bad idea. So I was already a pretty lazy grad student, as George can attest. And if I had had the prospect of running off and spending time on something other than my thesis research, I'm sure I would have.
So what could we do to increase the likelihood that people do this kind of stuff?
I think that there needs to be a pathway that you can simply step into if you choose to do something like this. So rather than me getting lucky and having to have so Google is well known for having this sort of greased track where you graduate and take your PhD and knock on Google's door and you're handed 120 grand a year working for Google. There's no similar pathway that matches you up with seed money and people who have been through the process before. And I think if something like that existed, it would remove a lot of the activation energy that's required. Had I had this idea, which I didn't first off, but had I come out of CMU wanting to build 3D scanners on my own and announced to the world in March of 2007, I'm going to found a 3D scanner company. I mean, I don't know if there's a mechanism that would have enabled me to do anything other than crash and burn, and having some adult supervision would have helped.
In terms of making it easy is all you do is jack up the failure rate.
Failure rate's high enough already, and I don't know that, particularly if you have someone sensible involved gatekeeping the access to this stuff, that necessarily you're going to result in high failure rate. And that's the problem of convincing administrations to spend money on this sort of thing to begin with, right, is that there is an intrinsically high failure rate, and that's why VCs spend so much but also take so much. It's a high-risk activity. For any $1 million that CMU spent, if they issued $10,000, $100,000 grants each year to do this sort of thing, the rate of return is probably at best break even. And then you have a lot of explaining to do to your trustees as to why you spent $900,000 for people to go off and try something crazy and they failed. It's very, very difficult to, sort of pick the horse race at time zero and have it be anything other than a gamble. That's what VCs are. It's gambling. Yeah. Tom?
Did you ever write a business plan, and if so, how close is it to what actually happened?
We did. So Idea Foundry helped us with that. The business plan originally was to build $1,000 scanners, stick them in GameStop, and scan people's faces. And then Microsoft came out with the Kinect, which it turns out does that pretty well. After we did a bit more market research and started looking at how the financials would break out, when you're at dollar amounts that are low like that, it's very hard to convince somebody to buy you down the road because you're building something that's cheap. And also very hard to simply stay in business at the scale that we represent right now. And that's part of the problem. We're at this very hard middle ground, and we've managed to arrive at a niche where it's okay for us to do this, but we're not to the scale that offshoring to China makes any sort of economic sense. But we're also beyond the scale where it can just be me working at 2 in the morning building something when a customer orders it. There's this weird middle ground. So in terms of the business plan, yeah, we did have one. It existed in its original form with this low-cost scanner for about, 3 months. At which point it was scrapped and retooled again at the $20,000 price point. That survived for 2 years, and the irony of all of this is now that we're a mature company, we're back to selling $2,000 scanners, but it's not the same. It's not even remotely what we thought we were going to be selling into market-wise. I think business plans exist to get you to think about money. I would not rely on them as a tool to dictate day-to-day operations. The number of times that I've been wrong with what I'd be doing next year is far more than when I've been right.
It seems like a lot of continuity in that you take a technology you developed in one context and then you spin it into the next.
Right.
So it's not as if you completely abandoned it.
Oh, no, yeah. The line scanning stuff directly came forward. So the laser kernel detector piece of code that I wrote for that very first fall of 2007 is present in a very much refined version, but in the same edge detector code in the foot scanning device. So no, we don't throw anything away. At this point, actually, you'll spend a lot of your startup life feeling inadequate and that you're not really an expert in the field. And at some point, you realize that you've simply been doing it for so long, the things that you have lying around are sufficient to solve enough problems. That tends to be what defines you as an expert. So no, yeah, I think it's a good point. We don't throw anything out, and things like the splatting from the foot project, or from the hand project are now in the foot project, and a lot of the mesh processing stuff has moved forwards as well. Yeah, there's some other questions. Yeah.
I was going to ask, what are your thoughts on like Kickstarter campaigns and the people who use them for like very initial stuff versus we have the product and now we just need to ramp up manufacturing?
I would suggest Kickstarter as after having gone through an economic development round. There is an element that I had not appreciated with all of this, of the advice that someone who has invested in you financially, but who is not emotionally involved in the project can bring to a situation. So we had a situation earlier in the spring where we were considering an acquisition offer. And I can tell you now, having been through that, that is it's very hard to separate the finances and the emotion. So if you have someone involved in the project early on who is not emotionally involved in it and can give you sound financial and business planning advice, that's much more useful than a giant pile of money at the beginning. My concern with Kickstarter is that it creates extremely high expectations and gives you much more money than you probably know how to manage out of the gate. And it's not that that's a bad thing. I just would like to see that after you've had a chance to run through the business plan kind of stuff and think that through a little bit. That said, it's a great way to get stuff. The terms are about as favorable as you can possibly hope for. They take 15% or something. So yeah, it's a great way to get your money. It's also a great way to get a bunch of expectations and really get yourself thrashed on Engadget if you happen to not deliver. So I would be cautiously in favor of it after you've gained a little bit of experience.
Thanks again.
Thanks.